Let's move on to the next topic, which is white balance. White balance is something which you would have probably seen in your cameras, like the symbolizations like sun, cloud, a house, or a bulb, or an incandescent bulb, and things like that. The general tendency is for people to put it in auto white balance, or they probably even not go back to the fact that they will check what white balance has been set on their camera or on their smartphone. So, what exactly is white balance? Based on the source of light, the light is associated with a color temperature, be it the sunlight, be it the sunlight during a cloudy situation, or be it the sunlight in shade, or be it like an artificial light source like an incandescent bulb or a fluorescent bulb. Each of these light sources have color temperature associated with it, and it is read in numerical values in thousand, which goes all the way from say thousand all the way up to 10,000, and the unit of measurement is called Kelvin. Now, in your camera, to ensure that the scene that you are capturing, if you want the white to be represented as an accurate white, this is exactly when white balance comes into picture. So when you set the camera's white balance to the situation that you're shooting, say you're shooting in daylight or you're shooting in a cloudy situation, whether you're shooting in artificial light or whether you're using flash, based on what situation that you're shooting in, using the correct white balance would ensure that you get accurate colors in your images. Say for example, you're shooting in daylight, and if you keep the camera's white balance in say daylight, that would ensure you that it is reading that particular light temperature, which is usually about like 5000 to 6500 Kelvin. It will ensure you that the image that you're photographing has correct colors represented. Now, let me tell you out of the box that if you do a mistake and if you're shooting raw, you can correct it when you're doing post processing of images. But if you're using JPEG, then the correction might be a little bit destructive. Now, let me go back to white balance once again. So, white balance is very important, especially when you're shooting, say, product images or when you say tabletop photography and things like that. The color cast that comes into picture if you're using a wrong white balance is something which is not accepted, especially in fashion photography, especially in things like product photography or advertising photography. The accurate color rendition is very, very important, and this is exactly where white balance comes into the picture. Most of the advanced or a newer generation cameras gives you an option to set the white balance to a specific value, say like 6570 Kelvin. You can actually go ahead and set it. There are digital handheld meters which are available, which can actually read light and tell you what exactly is the color temperature and what is the value that you need to set in your camera when it comes to the white balance setting. There are also options for custom white balance setting. We'll probably visit this topic in some other video, because these are very specific topics wherein we are to talk about gray cards and things like that. Now, when it comes to what is a suggestion from my side, most newer generation cameras, they have good auto white balance capabilities. So it's not that it will go wrong, or it's not that what you're doing is wrong, but as much as possible, let me repeat, as much as possible, try to set the camera's white balance to the situation that you're shooting in. Say, as an example, if you're shooting, say, like a landscape, or if you're shooting something like a wildlife, or if you're shooting like architecture and things like that, and you're shooting it in broad daylight, like say morning 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock or evening 4 o'clock, I highly suggest that you put the actual white balance setting that you require for that scene. Like in this case, if you're shooting daylight, so you use this. Assume that you're shooting indoors, wherein it is filled up with artificial light sources like LED bulbs or fluorescent lamp and things like that. Use the particular white balance setting based on the situation that you're in. There, I'll be show you a couple of examples wherein I can show you what is the impact that using a wrong white balance can bring into your images, irrespective whether you're shooting in daytime or nighttime, whether shooting indoor or outdoor. As much as possible, try to use the closest possible white balance setting in your camera. And if you're shooting in raw while you're doing your image editing or post processing, you have an ability to correct it or fine tune it later on without impacting the image quality. So try to use as much as close as possible. There is no wrong in using auto white balance, but when it comes to mixed lighting, the camera can get fooled and it can give you really awful results. So try to use correct white balance preset based on the situation that you're shooting. White balance can also be used for creative purpose. So we will see those examples in just a moment from now. So now first let's have a look at a few examples wherein what happens if you use a correct white balance setting and what happens if you use a wrong white balance setting. So in this situation, this is a typical early morning scene. This is shot from a drone, and the white balance that is used here is daylight. It's a daylight white balance is used. This is early morning. It has that slight warm glow to that light and things like that. So you get an image like this. I don't want to talk whether this is correct or wrong, okay? But when I show you what happens when you use a wrong white balance setting, say you had used a tungsten white balance instead of a daylight white balance, this is exactly what will happen. The image will get a blue cast and it will look unnatural. So for a scene like this, it looks very unnatural because for your naked eye, you know that the monument is white and it's a warm morning light and it was not showing blue. So when you use a wrong white balance, like say tungsten in this case, the image gives a very blue cast. Now let's look at a night scene. This is a photograph of the famous Ambavilas Palace in Mysore. If you have seen this building, this is filled up with bulbs, and the speciality of this particular place is that during evenings on weekend or during special occasions like Dasara and all, they light up all the bulbs and it looks phenomenal. Now, in this case, for this particular photograph, I have used tungsten white balance. Okay, that was the closest that I wanted to use to get the accurate colors. What would happen if I would have used daylight white balance? The image would have turned up like this. It would give that extra warmth to the image, which is not required, and also adding more yellow or that warmness to the image which is yellow and bright will make the image look very artificial and the colors will look totally off and this is not at all pleasing to your eyes. And this is not something which you would actually see in the real case also. Place would definitely not look like this and it would look more natural if we had used tungsten white balance instead of the daylight white balance here. Now let's have a look at a couple of examples wherein white balance can be used in a creative purpose. Now look at this particular scene. This is actually a early morning winter scene from a place called Bharatpur in northern India, which is very famous for winter visitors, birds, and things like that. If you want to bring in some sort of like a mood into an image wherein putting in that the color cast will actually make some sort of like a visual and a mental impact, that's exactly when you can use white balance creatively. Though this is an early morning scene, I've intentionally put tungsten white balance so that it gives you that blue hour type of feeling into that image. Keep in mind this was done in editing, not on the camera. If at all, if I had shot this in JPEG and if I had kept tungsten white balance when I was actually shooting it, the image would have come same, but I wouldn't have got an option to change it back to say daylight or whatever was the situation then. But this is done in editing. Now let's have a look at the other way around. Same place, Bharatpur, and a very typical scene wherein you have cycle rickshaws which will take you around in the park. So the sun is already up and above the horizon. This was probably around like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. The image was shot in daylight white balance, but pushing it a little further, say towards 6000 or 6500 Kelvin, which is typically the case which is associated with cloudy white balance. It will give you sort of that warm feel to the image, which can add to the visual impact of the image. As I told you, these are meant for creative purposes. These are done while doing image editing, wherein you're pushing the white balance towards more cooler region or towards more warmer region. This is something which you can do in image editing, need not be at the time of shooting. And if you have shot it in raw, you have more latitude to play with.